Hey and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to render our animation to an EXR sequence. So let's quickly go through our render settings. So let's start at the render properties, this little camera icon on the right hand side. Make sure your render engine is set to cycles. And if you have a GPU, set this to GPU compute. And then under sampling, we're going to focus on the render section here. You can minimize the viewport. And the noise threshold I usually keep on. This will increase the render time slightly. Maximum samples, I usually set this to around 256. If I do my final render, then I will increase this to about 512 or maybe 1024. But I think for this example, 256 should be enough samples. Then you can also choose if you want to denoise your render. I'm going to keep this on. Usually I don't denoise when rendering. It will just speed up the render a little, and we can always denoise it in the compositor. And I usually add grain on top of everything afterwards as well. But I think for this example, we can denoise our render. So that's fine. You can keep that on. Then if you go down slightly, you'll see motion blur. I'm going to untick motion blur because first of all, our camera move is not very fast. So there's not really motion blur in the scene, but you can also add motion blur back in when doing the compositing. Now you can't take motion blur out. So I think it's always safe to not render motion blur from Blender unless it's something very specific that you need that motion blur. But for now, let's just enable the motion blur. Next, if we go to our output properties, this is where you can set the resolution. So obviously we are using a 1920 by 1080 footage, so that's default. If you want to decrease the size of your render, the resolution, you can do that here. But for now, let's keep this on 100. Make sure your frame ranges are correct. We're starting at frame 1, ending at frame 150, which is perfect. And then for the output, we want to specify a folder where we want to render it. So I just created a folder called render1. And then we want to give our render a name as well. So I'm just going to call it render1. And then I'm going to place an underscore because it's going to add the frame number after that. So if you don't add an underscore, it might look a little bit confusing and it might not import correctly into your compositor. So always put an underscore just after the file name like so. And then we're going to click on accept. Next, we want to tell Blender what type of files we want to render. So we're not going to render a video, but we're going to render an open EXR multi-layer. Now, the reason we choose multi-layer is that we have all those render passes that we selected. And then that means we need to select an EXR multi-layer to include all those layers. Next, we have the color depth. Now, you've got two options, float half and float full. Now, 90% of the time, float half is perfectly fine because we're going to do compositing in 16-bit. And if for some reason you need to do your compositing in full 32-bit, then you will select this float full. But for, as I say, for most renders, float half is more than enough. The file sizes will be a lot smaller. And 16-bit is usually more than enough. So make sure your settings are set up like this. And then there's one more thing that we need to change before we can start our render. So currently, as you can see, we've got this background image. Our footage is actually set up in the scene. So if we render it right now, it's going to include this background image of the actual footage or the plate. And that's something we don't want. We just want to render our 3D objects with the shadows and all of that. Now, to disable this from our render, simply go to the compositing tab right here at the top, the compositing workspace, and then you simply untick right at the top here. It says use nodes. And you want to just simply untick that box. And now if you go back to layout, it's still going to appear in this viewport, but when we render, it's not going to be there. So let's quickly just save our project. And then one more thing I do before I render, I changed my viewport to solid view. That will just increase the render time slightly. Save your project again. And now we can click on render and render animation. Now it's going to start rendering all our objects and all the passes and everything, all the shadows, etc. And it's going to save an EXR image for each of the frames, each of the 150 frames. Now here on the side you can actually see all the render passes. If you click on this drop down here at the top where it says combined, you can see we've got combined, mist, and all these different render passes. So if I click on maybe AO, which is ambient occlusion, this will now show us the ambient occlusion pass in a second. There you go, you can see this is the ambient occlusion pass, or we can maybe change this to the shadow catcher pass, and you can see there we have all the shadows. So these are just showing you all the different render passes. Combined is basically everything combined, all the layers, so you can see the correct colors, etc. So let this run through. It will take a few minutes, maybe an hour, depends on the speed of your computer and your graphics card, and I will see you in the next lesson.